Hi everyone, this is Damien, and this is part 2 of part 7 of our Preventing Reaccessing series, which is part of our Deprogramming Monarch Mind Control series. We ask that anybody who watches this video first watch the first 2 parts of our deprogramming series, which we will put a link to in the description below, if, of course, you haven't watched them already. In this video, I'm going to be attempting to finish the video that I started several months ago, in which I outlined what my living situation, or my various living situations, I should say, have looked like during my deprogramming process. I left off talking about a sober home that I lived in for 18 months, and I was specifically talking about these 2 girls that I was rooming with, who were very difficult roommates, who were not letting me get much sleep. The reason that the sleep issue was such a huge issue for me at the time was not just that sleep is extremely important and sleep deprivation is a form of torture, but I was actually working a job and trying to get out of the SLE using the money I was making there and actually move into some kind of safe, stable, non-group housing. The job that I was working at the time was part-time and barely paid enough to cover the rent at that sober home, and I was actually still taking rent money from my mom at the time, but my attempts to save money were getting largely sabotaged by programming, by young alters in my system who were under mind control to disrupt our efforts to find freedom. And the sleep was a huge problem because we were literally so exhausted we could barely work. It was a pretty physical job, and it got so bad that we ended up falling asleep at the bus stop waiting for our transfer bus twice in a row, and we're like 2 hours late to work. The only reason that we were able to keep that job at all was that it was a transitional work program for people who were homeless or at risk of homelessness, because we were in a transitional living house and were definitely at risk of becoming homeless. We were able to work there even though we weren't on the street at the time. And so, that job was really set up to deal with people like myself who had a lot of problems, and they were a lot more forgiving than a normal job would be. But I still almost lost that job because my attendance during that time was so poor. But I did end up saving up a little bit of money and making my best attempt at finding safe housing from there. And I'm almost laughing painfully because I ended up going to another sober house instead, one that was far worse than the one I was in at the time. The rent, I was able to barely afford it, but not really. And, I was living month to month. And the house itself, it was attached to a church that was involved in heavy satanic ritual abuse and mind control. It was an MK Ultra house, and I'm having a hard time not switching into alters that were there for a lot of heavy trauma right now. I'm having a lot of trouble not glitching and reliving trauma, so I'm gonna try not to say too much about that. I was there for 7 months. It was extremely painful. I was surrounded by narcissists and sociopaths, and I learned a lot about fronts for satanic ritual abuse in churches, and how SRA clergy con not only direct MK Ultra victims, but also people in the public. And I would really like to actually make a video about that in some detail one day. I have a lot to say about it, but right now is just not the time. So I went through 7 months of really fighting the mind control and fighting front parts of my system that were being reprogrammed not to listen to me when I insisted that we were being mind controlled. Finally, I was able to break through after the pastor gave this unbelievably painful sermon, if you will, where he just flaunted the mind control techniques he was using on the congregation and said all of this just horrible, horrible stuff to show that he was a perpetrator. And it really actually helped me get through to my system and be like, hey guys, this guy is obviously really unsafe. These people have been treating you terribly. For the last little while that I was there, I was sleeping on the couch because I was so afraid of and traumatized by the woman who was living in my room who was a perpetrator. So, I ended up getting out of there. I didn't get out of there into safe housing. I managed to stay with a coworker for a couple nights. And I don't really want to go too much into who she was. She told me some things that make me think that she might have had some connection to the world that I come from. She at least seemed to have some understanding. She was very nice to us on the surface, but she was also quite emotionally a lot to handle. She was very stuck in her own trauma, and her place was not very clean, and there was a lot of dust that I was inhaling in the room I was sleeping in that literally made it impossible to sleep. And I had a really intense experience there that may have been a nightmare, but really seemed to me like it was likely some kind of MK Ultra thing. So, like I said, she said things that made me think she was connected. And I had that experience that, could have been some kind of nightmare flashback, but really seemed to me like something more was going on. So I got out of there quickly. My programming was going to make me leave that place pretty quickly, I think, anyway, as at the job that I was at, I had been assigned a social worker who was definitely REMC, and she wanted me to go into this other SLE, and I was pretty susceptible to her suggestion, and I ended up going to this place, this third SLE within the same general area that was just the best word to describe it would be a shit show. And there were REMC people there. I was immediately put into the room of somebody who was REMC. I was given an option to be in that room or this other room with more people. I sadly went with the option to be with the one who was REMC. But honestly, that person was a good person who I think was trying to get out themselves. And I think that ended up actually being a really good thing, because they accessed me and tried to reprogram me, and it did not work. I fought with absolutely everything that I had to not succumb to the programming.